Imagine cracking open a royal tomb sealed for over 2 centuries only to be hit by a wave of stench so foul it feels like the dead are trying to crawl back out. It's February 11th, 1869. Deep beneath the stone floor of Westminster Abbey, torchlight flickers across centuries-old walls as a group of workmen dig into the unknown. Dean Arthur Stanley stands over them, clutching a tattered map and burial records that don't quite match. He isn't here to make history. He's here to find the lost tomb of King James I, but what he uncovers instead is far worse than misfiled documents or architectural confusion. As the last slab of marble is pulled aside, a blast of air escapes a trapped atmosphere of rot pressure and something far more human. Inside the vault are 2 massive lead coffins, stacked like a grotesque bunk bed, one labeled Elizabeth, the other Mary. And here's the part. History books don't want to tell you Elizabeth's coffin is shaped like a body, tightly molded around the remains inside, still bearing the inscriptions, still holding the weight of centuries. And beneath it, the crushed remains of her sister. What began as a royal survey had turned into a Gothic nightmare, and the deeper Stanley digs, the more horrific the truth becomes. She was once the most powerful woman in Europe, the Virgin Queen, who crushed the Spanish Armada, who turned flirtation into diplomacy, and whose every word could change the fate of nations. But by March 1603, Queen Elizabeth the Fine was no longer the radiant icon of English glory. She was a ghost in her own palace, haunted, filthy, and refusing to sit down. For 4 days she lay speechless on the cold floor of Richmond Palace, surrounded not by courtiers singing her praises, but by fearful whispers and the smell of decay. Her ladies-in-waiting, desperate and helpless, lined the floor with cushions not for comfort, but because they knew she would fall. Elizabeth would stand motionless for 15 hours at a time, staring into the shadows, too afraid to lie down. Somewhere deep inside her, she knew to rest meant to die. And it wasn't just physical collapse, it was something far darker. Her mind began to unravel. Elizabeth Southwell, one of her ladies, reported that the Queen was plagued by visions of her own death, that she saw apparitions of her frail, broken body, that a playing card, a single face card with a nail driven through its center, was found on her chair. Was it witchcraft? A cruel joke? Or simply the manifestation of a woman who had spent her life surrounded by enemies and now found herself cornered by the one she could not outmaneuver, death itself? The once magnificent queen who had dazzled ambassadors with wit and ruled with terrifying cunning had become an object of pity. She had lost most of her teeth. Her once golden red hair had fallen out in clumps. She refused to bathe, refused to eat, and refused to allow anyone to dress her. The same courtiers who once fought for a single moment in her gaze now avoided her entirely. The smile that had enchanted Europe had decayed into a grimace of blackened gums and foul breath. Her royal body, once the symbol of divine authority, was literally decomposing before she even died. This wasn't just a queen dying, it was a living myth, collapsing under the weight of its own legend. And the tragedy was deeper than death. Elizabeth, who had spent a lifetime denying her womanhood for the sake of power, refusing marriage, enduring constant rumors, branding herself as both king and queen, was now reduced to a frail, terrified woman who couldn't even rest. Her body had ruled empires, but in the end, it was her body that betrayed her. And still, she would not surrender. Not to man, not to illness, not even to the grave. But death was waiting, and it would not wait much longer. On March 24, 1603, the woman who once claimed to have the heart and stomach of a king finally fell silent. Queen Elizabeth, the fur icon, ruler legend, died in the early hours of a cold spring morning. But her death was not the peaceful passing of a monarch surrounded by loyal subjects. It was a moment shrouded in secrecy, fear, and shame. Her lady of the bedchamber refused to allow a post-mortem. No physician would open her body. No official explanation was ever given. And that silence spoke louder than any eulogy. Because what were they hiding? To preserve the myth of the Virgin Queen, perhaps. But maybe, just maybe, there was something far more unsettling beneath the surface. Something about Elizabeth's body they didn't want the world to see. A deformity, a disease, a biological truth that threatened the very foundation of the image she had spent a lifetime constructing, and so they buried her secrets with her body. A month later, London wept. On April 28, 1603, Elizabeth's funeral procession began at Whitehall and wound its way through the streets to Westminster Abbey. It wasn't just a ceremony, it was a spectacle. Black-draped horses pulled a hearse covered in royal purple. Atop her coffin lay an effigy so lifelike, so eerily perfect, that crowds gasped and whispered as it passed. Dressed in regal robes, clutching a scepter crowned in death as in life, Elizabeth appeared to still rule from beyond the grave. But the reality beneath the velvet was far more grotesque. Her body, encased in a lead-lined coffin to preserve it, was already beginning to decay. Rumors whispered that it was too swollen, too discolored, too fragile to be seen. And so they made her a painted copy, a puppet queen to mask the rot beneath the pageantry. And yet the people mourned. Thousands flooded the streets, crowding rooftops and gutters, just to glimpse their queen one last time. Eyewitnesses wrote of the collective groan that rose from the crowd of men and women, openly weeping as her statue passed by. For all her flaws, Elizabeth had ruled them for 45 years. She had given them victory, stability, identity, and now that golden age was over. But the punchline of this spectacle, it wasn't the grandeur, it was the denial, the desperate attempt to hold on to a woman who had already gone. Elizabeth had always controlled her image, even in death. But death doesn't care about crowns. It comes for queens just like it comes for all of us. And in that purple-draped coffin behind the painted face and polished scepter, the final truth of power was beginning to leak through the seams. Elizabeth thought I was buried as a queen, but positioned as a message. Her body, once the living embodiment of Tudor power, now lay sealed inside a massive lead-lined coffin encased within wood and placed in the vault of her grandfather, Henry VIII, beneath his marble monument in Westminster Abbey. It was meant to be an eternal resting place among ancestors and kings. But just 3 years later, her remains were quietly moved, not with reverence, but with strategy. Because when James III, her successor, and the son of her Catholic rival, Mary, Queen of Scots, took the throne, he had his own legacy to shape. And that legacy began not with a coronation, but with a grave rearrangement. Elizabeth's coffin was removed and repositioned atop Mary's in a different vault within the abbey, stacked quite literally one on top of the other. A grotesque double-decker of political theater. Two women who had hated each other in life, one Protestant, one Catholic. One who burned heretics, one who beheaded queens, now fused together in death. But here's where the symbolism becomes chilling. Elizabeth's coffin was placed above Mary's. A final insult. A silent domination. James ordered a grand marble monument to be erected over the vault, one that bore only Elizabeth's image and her triumphs. Mary's name was relegated to the inscription, a diplomatic footnote, rather than an honored presence. The inscription read, "Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep." But no one was sleeping peacefully here. Elizabeth's massive coffin, hundreds of pounds of lead and wood crushed down upon Mary's for over 2.5 centuries. The queens were not partners. They were props in James's effort to rewrite history. And that's the true horror of this burial. It wasn't a tribute. It was a power play, a PR campaign in stone and silence. Elizabeth, once a queen who ruled alone and died unmarried, was now positioned like luggage stacked on top of her enemy. Not to honor her, but to elevate her above someone else. And Mary, reduced in death just as she had been in life, was buried beneath the very crown that had once hunted her. In the cold darkness of that vault, no hymns played, no choirs sang, only stone pressing against stone. Elizabeth and Mary, eternal rivals, locked together not by fate but by the cold calculations of a king who saw their bones as nothing more than bricks in his own legacy. You'd think a royal tomb sealed in stone, buried beneath one of the most sacred places in England, would be secure, revered, untouchable. But the truth is far more disturbing. Royal vaults weren't sealed sanctuaries of honor, they were time bombs of decay, politics, and quiet desecration. And the deeper you look, the more you realize that the dead were never allowed to rest. In 1645, more than 40 years after Elizabeth's death, someone named John Weir carved his name directly into her lead coffin. Not into the walls of the vault, not on the floor, on the Queen's actual tomb, a permanent scar across royal flesh. Who was he? A workman, a grave robber, an opportunistic official with too much time and too little reverence? We'll never know. But his graffiti tells us everything we need to understand. Even a queen wasn't safe from being touched, tampered with, or claimed. Think about that for a moment. The Virgin Queen who ruled for 45 years, defied empires, and crafted her image with meticulous control, had her tomb defaced like a back alley wall. And if one man could do that, what else might others have done deep beneath the abbey where no eyes watched and no records were kept? In an age where royal hair, teeth, bones, and even embalming fluids were considered relics or worse cures, the temptation must have been unbearable. A lead coffin filled with royal decay was a treasure chest for the superstitious, the greedy, and the curious. One snip of hair here, a lock of fabric there, and history was quietly, gruesomely stolen. Elizabeth wasn't alone in this fate. Her coffin wasn't the only one violated. It was part of a pattern. Vaults were often opened, sometimes officially, often not. Coffins were jostled, displaced, examined. The dead were moved like furniture. The graffiti on her coffin isn't just vandalism. It's a signature of how we treat the past with fascination, exploitation, and barely concealed disrespect. We tend to believe that monuments tell the truth, that stone is eternal and sacred. But the reality is far darker. Beneath the abbey, beneath all the marble prayers and national pride, lies a world of secrets carved in lead and soaked in silence. Elizabeth's coffin bears more than her name. It bears the fingerprints of those who couldn't leave her alone. The real horror isn't what time does to the body, it's what the living do to the dead. And sometimes it starts with just a name scratched into the skin of a queen. We like to believe that lead coffins were a mark of royal dignity, a way to preserve the body, contain the odor, and ensure a queen like Elizabeth Mai could rest undisturbed for eternity. But what they actually created was something far more grotesque, a sealed chamber of decomposition, a pressurized tomb where the dead didn't sleep, they simmered. Think about it. Lead is airtight, unforgiving. It traps everything inside: moisture, gas, rot. And over time, as the soft tissues of the body break down, they release methane, ammonia, hydrogen, sulfide, a cocktail of chemical despair. Now imagine all of that sealed into a metal box under hundreds of pounds of stone with no release valve. What you get is not preservation. You get a pressure cooker of death. Contemporary accounts whispered of Elizabeth's corpse exploding in her coffin. A dramatic claim dismissed by some historians, but not impossible. Other royal tombs tell us the same terrifying story. When Edward IV's vault was opened, his bones were floating in 3 inches of black gelatinous liquid, an unholy mixture of body fluids and rotted wood. In another case, parts of a royal skeleton were found stuck to the inside of the lead, fused by centuries of chemical reaction. These weren't just corpses. They were science experiments no one signed up for. And Elizabeth's coffin was no ordinary box. It was massive, lined with thick layers of lead shaped to mimic the form of her body. A lead coffin of that scale could easily weigh over 500 pounds, requiring 8 men to carry it. Now picture that coffin placed directly on top of Mary Wise for over 260 years. That's not just symbolic domination, it's physical. The weight of Elizabeth's legacy quite literally crushed her sister's remains, pressing down day after day, decade after decade, until their bones were entangled in death, like some grotesque parody of sisterhood. Here's the punchline. The very thing meant to honor royalty, this cold, shining metal, didn't protect them. It turned their corpses into ticking time bombs. And when Dean Stanley opened that vault in 1869, he wasn't just unlocking a tomb. He was cracking open 2.5 centuries of sealed decay. He wasn't greeted by reverence or peace, but by a stench so foul it cut through the holy silence of Westminster Abbey like a scream. We built these coffins thinking they'd preserve the glory of kings and queens. Instead, they preserve the truth that no amount of lead, no symbol of power, can stop the march of time, chemistry, and rot. We like to imagine that once a monarch dies, their story ends sealed in stone, wrapped in reverence, untouched by the politics they once wielded. But for centuries, royal corpses were not just laid to rest. They were used as trophies, symbols, tools of control. Death didn't free them from power. It simply gave others the chance to use their bones for their own agendas. Take Edward the Confessor. Nearly a century after his death, King Henry II opened his tomb not to honor him, but to plunder it. He removed Edward's pilgrim ring and the cloth of gold in which he was buried. That same cloth was later cut up into cloaks for the living relics refashioned as royal fashion. Even in death, Edward's body was divided and repurposed like treasure from a conquered land. And then there was Duke Humphrey of Gloucester. His tomb was visited not by pilgrims, but by desperate women, hoping the embalming fluid inside his coffin would cure their wrinkles. Sextons sold thimbles of it for profit. Physicians took samples for experimentation. Eventually, when the fluid ran dry, people took his hair, his fingernails, even his bones. The body of a noble duke became a medieval vending machine. This wasn't desecration. It was business as usual. Elizabeth. I wasn't exempt from this pattern. She was its pinnacle. Her image had been controlled, staged, and weaponized throughout her life. And in death, it was no different. Her coffin may have rested beneath Westminster Abbey, but her legacy was constantly reassembled above ground. Her effigy was updated centuries later, jewelry added, colors restored not to reflect historical truth, but to preserve the myth, to keep the Virgin Queen marketable, unrotting, untouchable. But the real body, the decaying, bloated, buried truth was quietly ignored. And the deeper horror, none of this was accidental. Royal remains were political instruments. James the Fine didn't move Elizabeth's body to honor her. He stacked her atop Mary to send a message. Henry II didn't open Edward's tomb to mourn, he opened it to extract authority. The church didn't protect Catherine of Valois, they charged people to view her body like a sideshow. Her coffin was literally opened for paying customers. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a system. In the end, royal flesh was never sacred. It was symbolic currency spent and respent long after the heart had stopped beating. Power may have animated these monarchs in life, but it devoured them in death. Because in a world obsessed with control, even a corpse can be manipulated. Even a queen can be merchandised. Above ground, she was still perfect. Draped in velvet robes, her face serene, her hands folded in eternal authority. The marble effigy of Elizabeth I at Westminster Abbey still reigns crowned, composed, and seemingly untouched by time. But that's the lie. Because just a few feet below her lifelike statue, sealed in darkness, lies the real Elizabeth, decomposing in a lead coffin, her body slowly collapsing under the pressure of centuries. This isn't just the contrast between a sculpture and a skeleton, it's the ultimate metaphor for how we remember power, clean controlled and carefully curated. The original effigy was painted in rich crimson, her orb a deep royal blue, her cheeks delicately colored to mimic living flesh. Even the 4 lions at the base were gilded. It was never meant to be accurate. It was designed to project strength, purity, immortality. A virgin queen in death as she was in life. But none of that color remains today. The gold is gone. The paint has faded. And the woman beneath it never looked like that in her final days anyway. In truth, Elizabeth died toothless, nearly bald, unwashed, paranoid, and hollowed out by time. The court avoided her. The stench was unbearable. Her body, when sealed inside the massive lead coffin, was already succumbing to rot. Yet above her, a pristine image was constructed to overwrite that reality, to comfort the nation, to rewrite the story. It worked. Visitors today walk through Westminster, gaze up at her tomb, and believe they're in the presence of greatness. They don't think about what's inside that coffin. They're not meant to. That's the power of the effigy. It's not just a statue, it's a mask we place over decay to make it tolerable. But beneath the alabaster skin and royal scepter lies the truth no monument can bury. Death comes for all of us, and it doesn't care how regal your funeral looks. Here's the punchline, Elizabeth. I controlled her image better than any monarch in history. She was the queen of illusion, the master of myth. But death wrote a different ending. The painted marble above tells the story she wanted the world to believe. The lead coffin below tells the one she couldn't hide. One is timeless, the other is rotting. And in that space between the lie and the corpse, between the crown and the collapse, we find the uncomfortable truth that legacy is sculpted by the living, but the body never lies. It was meant to be a scholarly survey, a quiet act of historical curiosity. But what Dean Arthur Stanley uncovered beneath Westminster Abbey in 1869 wasn't just a vault. It was a confrontation with everything the British Empire wanted to forget: rot, decay, and the illusion of permanence. Armed with maps, conflicting burial records, and Queen Victoria's permission, Stanley set out to find the lost tomb of James I. What he found instead was a chamber sealed for over 2 centuries, and the disturbing remains of 2 queens stacked like forgotten luggage. When Stanley's team broke through the stone ceiling, the air inside was thick and stagnant, reeking of centuries-old decay. The flickering torchlight revealed 2 massive lead coffins, one unmistakably shaped to mimic the contours of a human body lay heavily atop the other, Elizabeth above, Mary below. The grotesque symbolism was impossible to ignore. Even in death, one woman crushed the other. And yet, in his official account, Stanley was restrained, careful. He used words like distinctly shaped and noteworthy configuration, Victorian euphemisms designed to veil the horror in gentility. But the details still bled through. Elizabeth's coffin bore markings, initials, dates, and even a Tudor rose etched into the lead. More hauntingly, it bore the name of John Weir, a 17th century visitor who had vandalized the royal tomb, graffiti on a queen's casket. To Victorian sensibilities, this was unthinkable, but Stanley didn't dwell on it. He couldn't. Not in print. His mission was to catalog, not to scandalize. But between the lines, a darker narrative unfolds, one of royal bodies disturbed, disrespected, and quietly desecrated. And here's where the implications go deeper than any burial chamber. The Victorians, who prided themselves on honor, reverence, and empire, could not face the reality that even their most sacred institutions were built on human fragility and historical myth-making. The discovery of the vault shattered the illusion of timeless monarchy. Beneath the marble monuments and chiseled Latin inscriptions lay something disturbingly mortal: crumbling bones, bloated flesh, a foul atmosphere trapped in metal. It wasn't glory they found. It was truth. And it stank. Stanley published his findings, but only the polite version. He left out the smell, the discoloration, the grotesque visual impact of coffins pressed together under the weight of legacy. But he couldn't erase the symbolism. Because what the Victorians unearthed wasn't just a queen, it was a mirror, a reflection of how we sanitize death polish power and bury reality beneath ceremony. And no matter how deeply we hide it, time always finds a way to dig it back up. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of Westminster Abbey, where marble lions stand guard and history feels eternal, lies a truth no monument can silence. Even queens rot. Even legends dissolve. And no amount of stone symbolism or ceremony can hold back the march of time. Elizabeth I ruled an empire, terrified kings defied popes, and reigned without a husband in a world where women were expected to kneel. She was a master of image painting herself as the untouchable virgin queen, chosen by God, ageless, immortal. But in the end, her body told a different story. She died alone, unbathed, toothless, standing on swollen legs until she collapsed. She was too afraid to lie down, knowing death would be waiting. And death didn't disappoint. She was buried in lead, sealed in silence, and stacked atop the sister she once despised. Her effigy above the tomb remained flawless, draped in royal robes frozen in dignity. But below, the weight of her coffin literally crushed Mary's for over 2.5 centuries. That's not peace, that's pressure. And it speaks to something darker than just physical decay. It reveals how even in death, power continues to assert itself. Not with love, not with justice, but with dominance. We like to think we're better than the past, more enlightened, more humane. But this story dares us to ask, are we really? Because the truth is, we're still doing it. Still building perfect images of imperfect people. Still turning real human lives into polished legacies and curated Instagram reels. We bury the messy parts. We decorate the remains. We tell ourselves the myth matters more than the truth. But the body doesn't lie. Elizabeth's story is not just a tale of royal grandeur, it's a cautionary tale about control. About how far we go to shape our image and how quickly time dismantles it. She controlled everything in life except her own ending. And in that, she's just like us. Here's the real punchline. The woman who once said, "I have the heart and stomach of a king," was ultimately conquered not by enemies but by biology, by entropy, by gravity and gas. Her body decomposed like any other. Her legacy, no matter how grand, is now just a narrative built over bones. So what do we take from this? We take the reminder that no amount of power can protect us from mortality. That in the end, what we leave behind isn't the perfection of our public image, but the impact of how we lived and how we treated others. Elizabeth's life was one of strength, yes, but also of fear, loneliness, and myth-making. She was brilliant and brutal, glorious and grotesque, and that's what makes her human. In a world obsessed with legacy, political, professional, personal, her story teaches us this: don't build your monument on illusion. Don't chase perfection over connection, because time erodes all masks. The only thing that truly endures is truth, kindness, integrity. So the next time you walk past a statue or scroll through a highlight reel online, remember every face you see, no matter how polished, hides a story of struggle, decay, and mortality. And maybe, just maybe, it's not about conquering death or rewriting our image. Maybe it's about living with enough honesty that we don't have to. Because the marble may crack, the coffin may corrode, but how we choose to live, that's the one part of us that even time can't crush. If this story made you see history and power in a whole new light, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Was Elizabeth a victim, a symbol, or something far more human? Don't forget to save this video if it gave you chills, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next forgotten tale buried beneath the crown. The past still has a lot to teach us, and we're just getting started.